On Christmas Eve, my daughter-in-law walked up to me at my own front door and said, "This is our house now, old woman. You need to leave." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I went inside, packed one bag, and walked out into the cold night without a single word. By morning I was gone. And the $3 million they had been counting on. Gone with me. Their phones showed 100 missed calls. But I wasn't picking up. Not anymore. Before we go further, please subscribe to Granny's Voice, where we share powerful stories about women who rise up after being knocked down by the people they loved the most. My name is Louise Hartwell. I am 69 years old, and I have lived in Savannah, Georgia my whole life. I spent 35 years working as a hospital administrator, running departments, managing budgets, solving problems that would make most people's heads spin. I retired 4 years ago and settled into a life I had earned. A beautiful home on Magnolia Creek Drive, a garden I tended every morning, a community I had built over decades. I thought the hard part of life was behind me. I was wrong. My son Marcus was always a gentle soul. Even as a little boy, he was kind and quiet, the type who brought home stray cats and cried at sad movies. He grew into a good man, or at least I thought he had. He had my husband Gerald's warm eyes and his grandmother's soft laugh. Gerald passed away 12 years ago, and after that it was just Marcus and me. We were close in the way that only shared grief can make two people close. He called me every few days, visited on holidays, showed up with groceries when I had a cold. Then 6 years ago, he met Renata Cole at a work conference. She was 34, polished, sharp-tongued in a way some men mistake for intelligence. She wore expensive clothes and spoke in a clipped, careful manner that always made me feel like I was being evaluated. Marcus was dazzled by her immediately. She was confident in a way that swallowed him whole. I tried to keep an open mind. I really did. But there were small things that piled up over time. She never looked me in the eyes when she spoke. She corrected Marcus in public and laughed it off as a joke. She talked about money constantly. Not in the way of someone who had worked for it, but in the way of someone always calculating how much more they deserved. I said nothing. I smiled and passed the bread basket and told myself my son was happy. I believed that was enough. The wedding was held at a venue in Charleston. I paid for almost everything. Renata had very specific tastes and very little savings, but she spoke about both as if they were unrelated. Her parents contributed a fruit basket and a card with a $20 bill inside. Her mother made a toast that was mostly about Renata's accomplishments growing up. Her father fell asleep before the cake was cut. I watched Marcus look at her across the dance floor like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. I kept my thoughts to myself and danced with my grandson from my brother's family and tried to feel only joy. The first 2 years, they lived in a rental across town. Then Marcus's company downsized. And suddenly the conversation shifted. "Mom, you have all that space. It would just be temporary. 6 months at the most, and then we would be back on our feet." It was Renata who said 6 months. It was Renata who smiled her tight little smile when she said it. I knew even then that 6 months was a story they were telling themselves as much as they were telling me. But Marcus looked tired and embarrassed. And I could not say no to that face. The same face that used to fall asleep on my shoulder during thunderstorms. So I said yes, and they moved in, and the changes started almost immediately. Renata rearranged my kitchen cabinets the second week. Said she needed things to be more functional. My grandmother's china ended up in a box in the garage. Her yoga mat appeared in my sunroom. Her skincare products spread across the main bathroom counter like a slow invasion. When I mentioned the china, she said, "Louise, honestly, it was just collecting dust." She had already stopped calling me Mom by then. I was just Louise. Noticed. I did not say anything. Another mistake in a growing list. By the end of the first year, they were not paying any portion of the household bills. Marcus had found new work, but the money seemed to vanish into Renata's spending habits. When I gently raised the topic of sharing expenses, Marcus looked uncomfortable and said they were still getting back on their feet. Renata, who was sitting across the room scrolling through her phone, did not even look up. She just said, "We contribute in other ways, Louise." I thought about my grandmother's china sitting in a dusty box and tried to understand what those other ways might be. Around the 18-month mark, I heard Renata on a phone call. I was not eavesdropping. I was walking down the hallway to my own bedroom. She was talking to someone, a friend I imagined, and she was laughing and saying, "She barely uses half the house anyway. By the time we are done, it will practically be ours already." I stood very still in that hallway for a long moment. Then I walked quietly to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and made a decision. I was going to watch very carefully from that point forward. And I was going to call my attorney. I contacted Patricia Wren the next morning. Patricia had been my attorney for 20 years. I told her what I had been observing. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the many reasons I trusted her. She said, "Louise, let me ask you something. Have you ever added either of them to any of your accounts or property documents?" "No," I said. "Good," she said. "Let's make sure it stays that way, and let's start putting some things in place just in case." Over the following weeks, I met with Patricia 3 times. He updated my will. I moved certain accounts. I documented everything carefully. I felt better having a plan. But life in the house continued, and so did the slow erosion of boundaries. Renata began hosting her friends on weekends. My living room would be full of women I had never met, drinking wine from my good glasses, leaving rings on the coffee table my late husband Gerald had built with his own hands. I started spending more time in my garden just to have somewhere to go that felt like mine. Marcus noticed once and asked if I was okay. I smiled and said I just liked the fresh air. He nodded and went back inside, and I stood among my roses and missed Gerald very much. 3 months before Christmas, Renata began making remarks about the house that went beyond casual. She told her friend on a video call in my own kitchen that she was planning to renovate the downstairs bathroom in the spring. Not asking, planning. She mentioned to a neighbor over the fence that she and Marcus were thinking of putting in a pool. She said our yard with the easy confidence of a woman who believed what she was saying. I heard all of it. I wrote all of it down in a small notebook I kept in my bedside drawer. I was building something even if I did not yet know its final shape. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold. I had spent the day baking, something I always did on Christmas Eve. Ginger cookies, Marcus's favorite since he was 4 years old, and a sweet potato pie from a recipe my mother had written on a stained index card in 1987. The house smelled warm and good, and for a few hours I almost forgot what I knew. I went out in the late afternoon to drop a tin of cookies at my neighbor Vera's house. Vera was 83 and lived alone, and I made a point of checking on her around the holidays. I was gone less than an hour. When I came back, my key did not work. I stood on my own front porch and tried both keys and neither one turned. Checked the address. Magnolia Creek Drive. My house. My porch. My ginger cookies still cooling in my kitchen. I rang the bell. I heard movement inside. Then the door opened and there was Renata. She was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of wine, and she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as rehearsed. "Louise," she said, "we need to talk." She did not step aside to let me in. Kept my voice very even. "Renata, why is my key not working?" She tilted her head in that way she had, like a teacher about to explain something obvious to a slow student. "We had the locks changed today. Security reasons. This is a safety upgrade." I looked past her into my own front hallway. Marcus was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the floor. Renata continued. "Marcus and I have been talking a lot lately about the future. About stability. About what makes sense long term." Her voice was smooth and practiced. "The thing is, Louise, this house is too big for one person. You rattle around in it. There are whole rooms you never use. Meanwhile, Marcus and I need space to build our lives properly. We feel like this arrangement has been holding us back." "Arrangement?" "Yes." The word came out quietly. "The arrangement where you live here as if it is your house." She smiled. The smile did not reach her eyes. "Never had. This is our home now. There are some lovely senior living communities nearby. Very comfortable, very social. We think it would be wonderful for you." "Marcus," I said. He finally looked up. His face was miserable. Mom, Renata thinks. I do not care what Renata thinks, I said. I'm asking what you think. He opened his mouth. Renata touched his arm. One touch, and he went quiet like a light being switched off. He looked at the floor again. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what had been built in my home without my permission. Not just a plan about property. A different kind of construction. One where my son had been taken apart and put back together in a way that left no room for me. You have until morning, Renata said pleasantly. I suggest you pack what you need for now. We can arrange for the rest of your things to be picked up later. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at Marcus one more time. He was staring at a spot on the hallway floor. My boy who had cried at sad movies. My boy who brought home stray cats. I turned around and walked back to my car. I heard the door close behind me. I sat in the driver's seat for 3 minutes. Then I went to get what I needed. My neighbor Vera let me in without a single unnecessary question, which is one of the finest qualities a person can have. I borrowed her phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring because Patricia Wren has answered on the second ring for 20 years and I have never once taken that for granted. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Louise, do you remember our last meeting?" "I do," I said. "Good," she said. "Then tonight you rest. Tomorrow we begin." I felt something steady settle in my chest, like a foundation after a long rain. Vera made chamomile tea and brought out a tin of butter cookies and did not ask me to explain anything. We sat at her kitchen table and watched a Christmas special on her small television, and she patted my hand once and said, "You are going to be just fine, Louise." I believed her because Vera had been through things that made my situation look minor, and she had come out the other side of all of it with her back straight and her voice clear. I slept in her guest room that night under a quilt that smelled like cedar and lavender, and I did not cry until morning. Christmas morning. I lay in Vera's guest room and listened to the neighborhood wake up. Children somewhere down the street. Car starting. Birds deciding it was warm enough to be optimistic. My phone, which Vera had retrieved from my car along with my overnight bag, was quiet. Not a single message from Marcus. Not one. I had raised that boy alone after Gerald died. Driven him to every soccer practice and science fair and college interview. Sat with him in the emergency room at 2 in the morning when he broke his wrist in the 9th grade. Not one message on Christmas morning. I got up, washed my face, and looked at myself in Vera's bathroom mirror for a long time. I was 69 years old. I had run a hospital department with a staff of 40. I had buried my husband and kept going. I had raised a son by myself through the kind of grief that sits on your chest like a stone for years. I was not helpless. I was not confused. I was a woman who had been maneuvered, and I was not going to stay maneuvered. I made a list in my mind of everything that needed to happen. Then I brushed my teeth and went to find Vera's coffee pot. Patricia met me at her office the day after Christmas. She had come in on a holiday weekend without complaint, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously she was taking the situation. She had already pulled my property documents and reviewed the notes from our previous meetings. She spread everything across her conference table and walked me through it methodically. The house was mine, clean, no co-owners, no liens. My accounts were mine, moved and secured. My will had been updated 6 weeks earlier. They had nothing. They had changed the locks on a house they had no legal claim to. Here is what is interesting about people who believe they are very clever, Patricia said. They often forget that cleverness and legality are 2 entirely different things. I smiled for the first time in 2 days. We are going to send a formal notice today, she continued. We are going to document the illegal lock change as trespassing and property interference. And then we are going to give them exactly 1 opportunity to vacate voluntarily before we involve the sheriff's office. She slid a paper across the table. I signed it with a steady hand. The process had begun. The formal notice was delivered the day after Christmas by a process server named Carl, who Patricia said was experienced and efficient and had the kind of calm professional face that made these situations move smoothly. Marcus called me 4 minutes after Carl knocked on the door. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that one go too. By evening, they had called 11 times between them. I sat in Vera's living room and read a novel I had borrowed from her shelf and let every call ring through. The voicemails filled up. I did not listen to a single one. The next morning, Patricia called to tell me they had not vacated. This did not surprise either of us. She had prepared for it. The sheriff's deputy arrived at Magnolia Creek Drive at 10 in the morning on December 27th. I was not there for it. Patricia thought it was better that way and I agreed. She had a colleague present to document everything. Renata, according to the report I received later, argued with the deputy for 22 minutes. Marcus said very little. They were given until noon to collect essential personal belongings and leave. They left at 11:58. I did not go back to the house that first day. I needed it to be empty before I returned. Patricia confirmed it at 12:30. I drove over at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I sat in my car in front of my own house for a moment, just looking at it. The Christmas wreath I had hung on the front door the week before was still there. The lights I had strung along the porch railing were still on a timer, blinking gently in the gray December afternoon. Everything looked the same from the outside. I got out, walked to the door, and used the new key Patricia had arranged. I went inside. They had left quickly and it showed. Renata's things were scattered in ways that suggested grabbing, not packing. There were clothes on the bedroom floor and half-empty bottles on the bathroom counter, and a coffee cup left on Gerald's handmade table without a coaster. I stood in my living room and breathed. The house smelled different. Too much of someone else's perfume. Too much of someone else's habits. But underneath it, mine. My walls, my floors, my curtains, my history. I walked through every room slowly. I was taking inventory. I was taking it back. My grandmother's china was still in the box in the garage. I brought it inside myself, washed each piece carefully at the kitchen sink, and put it back in the cabinet where it belonged. Took an hour. I was glad for every minute of it. When the last cup was back in its place, I made myself a cup of tea using one of my grandmother's good cups, and I stood at my kitchen counter and drank it looking out at my garden. The roses were cut back for winter. They looked plain and bare but not defeated. They were just waiting for the right season. I understood that feeling exactly. The new locks were installed that same afternoon by a locksmith Patricia recommended named Dwight, who worked quickly and without making conversation, which suited me perfectly. He changed every lock in the house: front door, back door, side gate, garage. He gave me 4 sets of keys. I held all 4. When Dwight left, I stood in my front hallway for a minute, just to feel the house being mine again in a complete and official way. Then I called Vera to tell her she could stop worrying. She said she had never stopped for a single minute, and I believed her. Over the next few days, the calls continued. By New Year's Eve, the combined missed calls from Marcus and Renata had reached 100. I know the exact number because Patricia had me keep a log for legal documentation purposes. 100 calls. 100 times they reached for a phone and tried to pull me back into a story where I was the supporting character in my own life. I logged each one, time and date, and handed the list to Patricia without listening to a single voicemail. She said the log might be useful if they pursued any kind of counterclaim. I said I hoped they would try. New Year's Day I spent entirely alone and entirely on purpose. I made a proper breakfast, eggs and toast and orange juice from the oranges in my backyard tree, and I ate it at my kitchen table looking out at the garden. I did my crossword puzzle. I repotted the African violet on my windowsill that had been looking droopy since November. I called my friend Sylvia in the afternoon, who had known me for 40 years and who said exactly the right things, which mostly involved colorful opinions about Renata that I will not repeat but that I will say I appreciated deeply. Sylvia came over the following Saturday and we went through every room in the house together. She helped me remove the remaining traces of Renata's occupation. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly and practically. The adhesive hooks she had put on the bathroom walls. The throw pillows in colors I had not chosen. The spice rack reorganization I had never asked for. We boxed everything up neatly, things that could be donated to the church sale, and left the rest at the curb. When we were done, the house looked like mine again. Felt like mine. Sylvia made pasta for dinner, and we opened a good bottle of wine, and I slept better that night than I had in 2 years. January brought a letter from an attorney named Brendan Cole. He was representing Marcus and Renata. The letter was 4 pages long and full of language designed to sound authoritative and slightly threatening. Patricia read it and called me. She was smiling, I could hear it in her voice. "Louise," she said, "they are arguing that they made significant contributions to the maintenance and improvement of your property during their residency, and that they are entitled to compensation and potentially a share of its value." Waited. "This is what is called a long shot," she said, being very generous. Patricia prepared our response over the following week. It was detailed and precise and included photographs, financial records, the call log, the documentation of the illegal lock change, and a statement I had written myself about the actual costs they had avoided paying during their stay. The total they had saved by not paying fair market rent for 2.5 years was significantly more than whatever speculative contribution they were claiming. Patricia sent it with what she described as a polite cover letter. I imagined Brendan Cole reading it and decided I was very glad Patricia was on my side. We did not hear back from Brendan Cole for 3 weeks. When we did, the letter was considerably shorter. 2 paragraphs. His clients were withdrawing their claim. Patricia called it a predictable outcome. I called it a relief, not because I had been afraid, but because I was tired of spending energy on people who had already taken enough of it. I put the whole correspondence file in a drawer and decided to think about my garden instead. The roses would need attention in February. I had been meaning to add a climbing variety along the back fence. I had a lot of plans for spring. In February, I heard from my nephew James, who kept in loose contact with Marcus through a mutual friend. Marcus and Renata were having serious difficulties. Renata had been telling people in their social circle that I had thrown them out of the house they had been renovating out of their own pocket, a version of events so far from reality that I genuinely marveled at it for a moment before moving on. James said Marcus seemed unhappy. He mentioned that Marcus had tried to reach me through James as a kind of intermediary. I told James gently but clearly that I was not ready for any contact, and that I would let him know if that changed. I spent February doing exactly what I had planned. I worked in the garden every morning when the weather allowed. I replanted the back border with a mix that would come up in layers through spring and summer. I ordered the climbing roses, a pale pink variety called New Dawn that my mother had grown along our back fence when I was a child. When they arrived as bare root sticks in a brown paper package, they looked unpromising, but I planted them carefully and trusted the process. Gardening had always suited me. It required patience, consistency, and the understanding that results took time. I also began attending a morning walking group organized through the neighborhood community center. Every Tuesday and Thursday, a group of us met at 7:30 and walked a 3-mile route through the neighborhood. There were 8 of us regularly. A retired teacher named Dottie who had strong opinions about hydrangeas. A former contractor named Bill who could identify every tree on the route by name. A woman named Anita who had moved to Savannah from Chicago and found the slower pace both delightful and slightly suspicious. I looked forward to those mornings more than I had expected to. Spring arrived, and the garden rewarded the attention I had given it. Things came up that I had forgotten I had planted. A cluster of purple iris along the side path that had been dormant for years suddenly produced more blooms than I had ever seen from it. The New Dawn roses put out their first tentative leaves. The raised bed I had rebuilt was producing more lettuce than I could eat, which meant I was bringing bags of it to Vera and to the Tuesday walking group and to the church hall. I started writing things down in a garden journal, something I had meant to do for years. It was Patricia who first raised the question of the will again in March. She called it a routine review, which was her way of suggesting it was time to think carefully about what I wanted to happen with everything I had built. We met at her office on a Tuesday afternoon. She had a copy of the will I had updated before Christmas and a fresh notepad. She asked me to walk her through my current thinking about each major asset. It was not a heavy conversation. It felt, actually, like the kind of thinking I should have done years earlier, carefully and clearly and completely on my own terms. The house on Magnolia Creek Drive, I told her, I wanted to leave to the Savannah Children's Medical Foundation. I had been on their volunteer committee for 4 years before Marcus and Renata moved in and consumed most of my available attention. I intended to go back to that work. The house, when the time came, could fund a wing or an endowment or whatever they needed most. Patricia wrote it down without expression, which was what I appreciated about her. She never told me what to feel about my own decisions. She just documented them precisely and made them legally solid. My financial accounts I divided between the Children's Foundation, a local women's shelter that had been struggling with funding since a grant expired, and a scholarship fund at the nursing school where I had done my early training before moving into administration. The scholarship would support students who were the first in their families to pursue healthcare careers. That had meaning to me. I had been that student once, the first in my family, the one who did not entirely know what she was doing but kept going anyway. Patricia wrote it all down. The total estate value at current assessment was just over $3 million. There was a line in the will for Marcus. Patricia asked me about it carefully. I thought about it for a long moment. I thought about the boy he had been and the man he had become and the Christmas Eve floor he had stared at instead of looking at me. I thought about 100 calls I had never answered. Then I thought about the fact that he was still my son, even now, even after everything, and that I did not want to be the kind of person whose grief had no limit to it. I left him $1. Not nothing but a clear statement. A door that was technically open but practically closed. Patricia reviewed everything, asked her clarifying questions, made her notes. At the end of the meeting she said, "Louise, this is one of the most clearly intentioned wills I have prepared in 30 years of practice." Said thank you. She said, "I mean it as a compliment." I know I told her. We shook hands. I drove home with the windows down even though it was still technically too cool for that because the air smelled like the gardenia someone 3 streets over had planted along their fence and I wanted to breathe it in. Some days that is more than enough. That was one of those days. In April James called again. This time his tone was different, more careful. He said Renata had left Marcus. She had moved to Atlanta with someone she had apparently known for some time. Marcus was living in a 1-bedroom apartment near his office, and by all accounts was not doing well. James asked again gently, whether I might be open to some kind of communication. I sat with the question for a moment. Not the answer, just the question itself. I thought about what I actually wanted, separate from what I was supposed to want and separate from what Marcus needed. What did Louise Hartwell actually want? I told James the first would think about it. I was not saying yes. I was not slamming a door. I was thinking about it genuinely, which was more than I had been willing to do 2 months earlier, and I thought that deserved honesty. James said he understood and he would wait to hear from me. We talked for a while after that about other things, his kids, his vegetable garden, a trip he was planning. Normal things. Felt good to talk about normal things. After we hung up I sat in the garden until the light changed and the birds went quiet and the evening settled in soft and blue. May brought a letter that was not from an attorney. It was handwritten, 6 pages, on plain white paper in handwriting I recognized from every birthday card and Mother's Day note for 38 years. Marcus. He wrote that he had been in therapy since January. He wrote about the things he had come to understand about how Renata had operated and about his own choices within that. He did not blame Renata entirely. He was careful about that, careful in a way that suggested he had worked at it rather than arrived at it easily. He said he knew he did not deserve forgiveness. He said he was not asking for it. He wrote, "I left you standing on your own porch on Christmas Eve and I told myself Renata was right and I knew she wasn't and I didn't say anything and I will not stop being ashamed of that." He wrote about Gerald. He wrote about the soccer practices and the emergency room at 2 a.m. He wrote about the ginger cookies and how he had thought about them on Christmas morning, the cookies I had been baking when everything happened, still sitting on the cooling rack inside a house that was supposed to have been taken from me. He said he thought about those cookies often. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in the drawer with the attorney correspondence and let it sit there for 2 weeks. I went about my regular life. I walked with Dottie and Bill and Anita on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I worked in the garden. I went back to the Children's Foundation Volunteer Committee, which welcomed me back warmly and put me to work immediately on a fundraising event planning committee. I had 2 friends over for dinner and made the sweet potato pie from my mother's index card recipe, and we talked until 11 at night, and it was easy and good. After 2 weeks, I took Marcus's letter out of the drawer and read it one more time. I was looking for the calculation. I was looking for the angle, the ask, the thing underneath the thing. I read it very carefully. I had spent 40 years in hospital administration reading between lines. I did not find what I was looking for. What I found instead was a man who sounded genuinely lost and genuinely sorry and genuinely unsure whether sorry was even a relevant word anymore. I sat with that for a long time. I did not answer the letter. But I did not put it back in the drawer. I left it on my desk. The Children's Foundation fundraiser was held on the first Saturday in June. I was on the planning committee and had been involved for months, but the evening itself was better than I had expected. The venue was the Savannah Botanical Garden, which had opened for a private event, and the evening was warm and the flowers were in full high summer form and the people were generous and kind and there for the right reasons. We raised more than the committee had hoped for. I stood in the garden at the end of the evening, after most guests had left, and felt something I had been working toward without quite naming it. Wholeness, maybe. Continuity. I thought about Marcus. Not the Marcus of Christmas Eve, the one staring at the floor. I thought about the earlier version, the boy at the soccer field, the young man at Gerald's funeral who had held himself together for my sake, and then cried quietly in the kitchen when he thought I was asleep. I thought about the letter sitting on my desk. I was not ready to call him. I was not ready to meet. But I realized, standing in that garden on a warm June evening, possibly ready to write back. Not much. Not a reopening. But something. A small and careful something. I wrote 3 sentences on a note card. I said I had received his letter. I said I needed more time. I said I was glad he was in therapy. That was all. I addressed it to his apartment, the address James had given me. I mailed it before I could rethink it. 3 sentences. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not a return to anything that had existed before. Just 3 sentences that said he had not sent his letter into complete silence. I thought about what Patricia had once said to me, that the most powerful position is not the loudest one. I thought she was right about that. Summer passed. I want to describe it properly because it deserves to be described properly. I woke every morning and made coffee and spent an hour in the garden before it got too hot. The new dawn roses climbed. By July they had covered the first 2 horizontal wires I had strung along the back fence and were reaching for the 3rd. They bloomed in clusters of pale pink that were almost exactly the color I remembered from my mother's fence in childhood. I cut a bunch every week and put them on the kitchen table. They made the whole room smell like something worth coming home to. I had dinner with Vera every Sunday. I called Sylvia on Saturdays. I read 3 or 4 books a month, mostly history and biography, occasionally a novel if the summary caught me. I went to 2 concerts at the Arts Center with Dottie from the walking group, who turned out to have strong and excellent taste in live music. I volunteered every other Wednesday at the women's shelter, helping with a job readiness workshop I had helped design in the spring. The women in that workshop were serious and capable and working against obstacles I had not faced, and spending time with them did something important to my sense of proportion. Marcus wrote again in August. A shorter letter this time. 3 pages. He was doing better, he said. He had been promoted at work, which had surprised him. He had started running, which surprised him more. He said he was not writing to ask for anything. He said he had understood from my note card that I needed time and that he would give me whatever time I needed. He said he was not going to stop being my son even if I decided I did not want a relationship with him. He said that was not a threat or a plea, just a fact he needed to put on paper. I read that one twice. Then I called James, not about the letter, just to talk. James was one of those people who did not require every conversation to have a purpose. We talked for 40 minutes about his kids and my roses and a documentary we had both watched separately about migratory birds. At the end he said, "How are you doing, Louise, really?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I think I am doing well." "Mean that?" He said, "I know you do, that is why I asked." We said good night. I sat in the kitchen in the quiet and felt the truth of what I had said settle around me. Christmas morning. I woke at 7. The light came in through the bedroom curtains the way it does in December, low and pale and somehow more thoughtful than summer light. I lay in bed for a few minutes just listening. The neighborhood was quiet. Car passed. A door closed somewhere. The ordinary sounds of a morning that was mine to fill however I chose. I got up, made coffee, went out to the garden in my coat and scarf. The roses were bare canes along the fence, but even bare they had a kind of architecture to them. A clean and purposeful structure waiting for the season to turn. I stood in the garden and thought about where I had been 1 year earlier. Standing on this same ground, in this same December light. Coming home from Vera's with cookies and finding my key would not work. I thought about Renata in the doorway with her practiced expression and her glass of wine. I thought about Marcus and the floor. I thought about the quiet 3 minutes I had spent in my car before deciding what came next. I had been 69 years old, alone on a cold Christmas Eve, locked out of my own home by people I had tried to love properly. And I had decided to act. 1 year later I was standing in my garden on Christmas morning. The house was behind me, mine, clean, restored, filled with things I had chosen and people I had invited and nothing I had not wanted. The will was signed. The garden was settled. My grandmother's china was in its cabinet. The new dawn roses were on the fence. The photograph of Gerald was on the mantel. The sweet potato pie recipe was on the kitchen counter. Every single thing in that garden and in that house was there because I had decided it would be. I breathed the cold morning air and felt, simply and completely, like myself. January again. I want to tell you about something small that happened in January because I think it matters. I was at the grocery store on a Tuesday morning, the quietest time to go, which I had always preferred. I was in the produce section looking at the citrus, the way you do in January when citrus is one of the things that is properly in season and bright and good. A woman near me was struggling to reach a bag of grapefruit on the upper shelf. She was older than me, in her late 70s maybe, small and careful in her movements. I reached up and got the bag for her. She thanked me warmly. We stood there a moment and she asked how I was, the way strangers sometimes do in Savannah, where people still talk to each other in grocery stores. I said I was very well, thank you. I meant it with a completeness I recognized because it was relatively new. She smiled. She said, "You look like a woman who knows where she is going." I thanked her for that. I thought about it the whole drive home. I put the phrase in my garden journal that afternoon. A woman who knows where she is going. I thought that was about right. February. Marcus called on my birthday, February the 9th. He had remembered. He had called every year of his life except the last one, which neither of us mentioned. He said happy birthday, Mom, in the voice he had used since he was about 11 years old and which I would always recognize. Said thank you. He said he hoped it was a good one. I told him about the birthday breakfast I had made myself, which was elaborate and specifically designed to include every food I actually liked without compromise. He laughed. It sounded like his father a little, that laugh. I was glad I had answered the phone. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about Christmas, not about Renata, not about what had happened or what it had cost either of us. We talked about ordinary things, his work, my garden, a book he was reading, the running he had taken up that he said he still did not entirely understand why he enjoyed but did. I told him about Dottie and the concerts and the job readiness workshop at the shelter. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. It was the conversation of two people who were still figuring out what they were to each other but who were willing to keep trying. I thought that was enough for now. Spring came again. The new dawn roses leafed out in March, the pale green leaves climbing up toward the roofline, going further than last year as I had known they would. The iris bed that I had divided in the fall bloomed twice as densely as it ever had. The raised bed went in again, this time with tomatoes as well as lettuce because I had decided I wanted tomatoes and there was no one to consult about it except myself. The garden journal filled up. I bought a new one in April. This too felt like something worth noting. The Children's Foundation held their spring gala in April, and I was on the organizing committee again and more central to it this time, having spent the year rebuilding my involvement. The event raised more than twice what the year before had raised. Afterward, the foundation director, a woman named Carolyn who had worked in pediatric medicine for 25 years, took my hand and said, "Louise, your engagement this year has changed what we are capable of." I did not quite know what to do with that, so I said, "I am just glad to be useful." She said, "You are considerably more than useful." I drove home thinking about that. I want to tell you what the house felt like that second spring. I want to tell you because I think it is the most important part of this story in some ways, more than the locks or the legal filings or the 100 missed calls. The house felt like mine in a way that went all the way through every room and every hour of every day. Not because of the will or the documentation or the evidence that I had the right to be there, but because I had lived through the attempt to take it from me and I had chosen every single thing I wanted about my own life and carried them back inside. The coffee was always the blend I liked. The music in the morning was what I wanted to hear. The calendar had things I had chosen for myself: the walking group, the foundation meetings, the shelter workshop, dinners with Sylvia and Vera, and the women I had let properly back into my life. The garden was planned the way I wanted it. The china was in the cabinet. Gerald's photograph was on the mantel. And every morning I woke up and made my coffee and went to the garden, and it was mine, the way it had always been supposed to be mine, the way I had always deserved it to be. Marcus came back to the garden in May. He had asked in April, a text message, brief and careful, whether he might visit again. Said yes. He came on a Saturday morning with the coffee from Broughton Street again, which I had started to think of as his contribution. We walked the garden. He noticed how far the roses had climbed. He said, "Mom, they're going to reach the roofline by fall." I said, "That's the plan." He smiled. It was his father's smile, which I had not seen on his face in a long time. We sat in the garden chairs for a while after the tour, and he told me more about his year. He talked about therapy. Not in a way that required anything from me, not presenting it for approval or credit, just telling me honestly about the work he had been doing and what he had come to understand. He said he was learning the difference between being influenced by someone you love and being dismantled by them. He said he thought the difference was whether you could still find yourself in the mirror. I thought that was put well. Told him so. He looked surprised that I had said something approving and then immediately tried not to look surprised, which I found quietly, like the first genuinely normal moment between us in years. In June I made a decision about the will. Not a large change. I called Patricia and we met for lunch, which was slightly unusual, but she had suggested it and I had liked the idea. Over good food she asked me how I was thinking about things. I said, "Patricia, I want to add a small bequest for Marcus. Not significant, not a reversal, but something beyond $1. Something that said I had not closed the last possible door." She asked me what amount I was thinking. I said $10,000. Enough to matter in a practical way if he needed it. Not enough to have ever been what Renata was after. Patricia wrote it down and said she thought that was a very Louise Hartwell kind of decision. I laughed. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant thoughtful and unsentimental and with a long view. I said I would take that. We finished our lunch. She updated the will that week. I did not tell Marcus. It was not for him to know. It was for me to know, a private decision about what I actually believed about the kind of person I wanted to be when everything was quieter and cleaner and time had done its work. I wanted to be someone who left a small door open, not because I had forgotten, but because I had not and had decided anyway. Summer. The second summer. I want to tell you it was exactly like the first because in most of the ways that mattered it was. Same walking group, same garden hours, same Sunday dinners with Vera, same Saturday calls with Sylvia. But it felt more settled. The first summer had the quality of reclaiming, of putting things back where they belonged, of pushing back against what had tried to move me. The second summer felt less like a reclamation and more like simply living. Just mine. Just good. The roses reached the roofline in August, right on schedule, exactly as Marcus had predicted. I cut a long stem and put it in a glass on my desk. I sat and looked at it while I wrote in my garden journal. I wrote, "The new dawn roses reached the roofline today." I planted them as bare sticks in February of last year during the worst of it, because a garden requires you to act on faith in the future even when the present is difficult. They are exactly what I planted them to be. I thought that was true of more than just the roses. I did not need to write that part down. I already knew it. I just sat with the flower in the glass and the summer light coming through my window and let it be what it was. In September of the second year, Patricia called with a question I had not anticipated. The Savannah Children's Foundation, she said, had been in touch with her directly. They had heard, through the charitable community, that I intended to leave the house to them in my estate. They wanted to know whether I had any interest in a different arrangement, a living arrangement, whereby I would transfer the property now in exchange for a named endowment, a guaranteed life right to remain in the house for as long as I wished, and a formal role on their advisory board. I asked Patricia to tell me more about how that would work. She explained it carefully. It was not unusual in philanthropic circles. The house would legally become the foundation's, but I would have a lifetime right of occupancy, fully protected. The endowment would carry my name. The advisory role would be meaningful, not ceremonial. The tax implications were, according to Patricia, significantly more favorable than a testamentary gift. I sat with the information for a week. I talked to Sylvia about it. I walked through the garden for several mornings thinking about it. Then I called Patricia back and said yes. The arrangement was signed in October. There was a small ceremony at the foundation office with board members and staff and Carolyn the director and Patricia and Vera who came as my guest. Someone took a photograph of me signing the documents. Carolyn gave a speech. I was not prepared for the speech, which was specific and kind and covered things about my career and my history in Savannah that I had not known anyone had compiled. I sat in my chair and listened to my own life summarized by someone who meant every word, and I thought about Gerald, and I thought about my mother's roses on the old fence, and I thought about the Christmas Eve porch. After the signing, at the small reception, Carolyn stood beside me and said, "Louise, I want you to know what this house is going to do." She described the plans. A family resource center in the main rooms. Respite accommodation for families of long-term patients. A garden program for children in the neighborhood, using my garden specifically, the one I had been building since the beginning of all this. I listened to each thing she described and thought about where each thing would go in the house and the garden. And it felt entirely right, the way the right decision feels when you have arrived at it honestly. I walked home from the reception because it was a beautiful October afternoon and I wanted to. I went through the neighborhood slowly, looking at things, the way I had looked at Christmas lights the year I was locked out of my own house. The year before last now. Time moves. I turned onto Magnolia Creek Drive and walked up to the front porch. The wreath I had put up was still there. The garden was settling into its autumn posture. The roses were done blooming, but the canes were strong along the fence, going all the way to the roofline. I stood on the porch for a moment before going in. Then I went inside, made myself a cup of tea in my grandmother's good china, sat in my kitchen, and looked at the garden through the window. Carolyn had asked what I wanted the garden program to be called. I had told her I would think about it. Sitting there with the tea and the late October light, I thought about my mother in her garden, cutting roses in the morning. I thought about what she had taught me, not in lessons, but in example about patience and care and the understanding that you plant for seasons you may not live to see. I had a name in mind. I would tell Carolyn on Monday. November came. I want to tell you about a small thing, as I told you about the grocery store woman in January, because small things are the actual texture of a life and I have learned not to skip them. Marcus came to the garden for the last time before winter. He helped me cut the roses back for the cold. He had learned, from a book apparently, the proper angle for a winter cut, and he applied it carefully and correctly to each cane, which I noticed without mentioning. We worked for 2 hours in the cool November air. When we were done, we stood back and looked at the bare fence. He said, "I know they don't look like much right now." I said, "They never do in November. But they come back." He nodded. He understood I was talking about more than roses. He did not say anything to that, which was the right response. We went inside and I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about small things for an hour. When he left, he paused at the front door and said, "Mom, I know I don't get to ask for things, but can I come back in spring? When they bloom?" I looked at him in the doorway of my house, my son, considerably changed, still working at it. Said, "Yes, come in spring." December. The second anniversary. I approached it as I had the first, on purpose and fully prepared. I baked the ginger cookies and brought half to Vera. I made the sweet potato pie on Christmas Eve morning. I set the table with the good dishes. I lit the candles. But this year I had invited people. Vera came for dinner, and Sylvia and Dottie from the walking group, and Anita, who had moved from Chicago and was still finding the slower pace slightly suspicious but had decided to stay anyway, and 2 women from the shelter workshop who had completed the program and had asked once whether I ever had people over, and I had said yes. We ate at the big table in the dining room that I had barely used in years. I had made too much food on purpose, which was the correct amount of food for a full table. There was wine and there was laughter, and there was the kind of conversation that moves easily between serious and funny without losing either. Vera told a story about her late husband that had the whole table in tears, first the sad kind and then the laughing kind, which is the best way for a good story to end. I looked around the table at all of them and thought, this is what a house is for. Marcus sent a card and a small plant for the garden, a hellebore in a terracotta pot, with a note that said, "For the garden in spring, Mom." I put it on the kitchen windowsill where it would be safe through the winter. I would plant it properly in March when the ground was ready. I thought about the fact that my son had sent me something to plant, something future-facing, something that required care and time and the faith that spring would actually come. I thought he had chosen well, possibly better than he knew. Christmas Day I woke early and went to the garden in my coat while it was still mostly dark. The roses were bare on the fence. The hellebore was on the windowsill. The iris bed was quiet under a light frost. The whole garden was waiting, the way a garden always is in winter, not absent but patient. I stood in the early dark and felt the year behind me and the year ahead of me and the ground underneath me, which was mine in the deepest possible sense. Not because of any document, but because I had chosen it and worked it and fought for it and given it a future. I want to tell you something I have learned. Not advice, because I did not ask for anyone's advice when I needed it most, and I do not plan to give it unsolicited now. Just something true that I have arrived at. When someone tries to take what is yours, they are counting on you to be smaller than you are. They are counting on age or politeness or love to make you go quietly, to accept the door being closed in your face, to believe the story they are telling about what you deserve. They are counting on you not to know your own size. I knew my size. Maybe not on Christmas Eve, standing on the porch with a key that would not turn. Maybe not in that moment. But in the car 3 minutes later I remembered it. 35 years of hospital administration. 12 years of raising a son alone. A garden I had built from scratch. A life that was mine to the roots. I remembered my size and I acted on it. And everything that followed was the consequence of that one decision made in 3 quiet minutes in a car on Christmas Eve. I am 71 years old now. I know exactly who I am. The new dawn roses will bloom again in May. The foundation will open the Family Resource Center in the house in the spring, with a ribbon cutting that I will attend as an advisory board member and a resident and the woman whose name is on the endowment. The garden program will be called the Margaret Hartwell Garden, after my mother, and will begin in June with 12 children from the neighborhood who have been signed up by their parents since October. I will be there for the first session. I will show them how to plant something and how to wait for it and how to trust that the season will change. Vera says I look different from 2 years ago. She said it recently and directly, which is her way. She said, "Louise, you look like a woman who put something down that was too heavy to carry and decided not to pick it back up." I thought about what I had put down. The performance of a certain kind of family. The cost of staying quiet. The weight of hoping people would be who I needed them to be rather than who they had shown me they were. Vera was right. I had put all of it down. I was not carrying it anymore. I was just in my garden in the morning with my coffee and my roses and my own good life. There is one more thing. Patricia called me in November of the 2nd year to tell me that Renata had attempted to contact her office. She had apparently heard through some channel about the foundation arrangement, about the endowment, about what had become of the inheritance she had restructured her marriage around. She had asked Patricia, very specifically, whether there was any possibility of a conversation. Patricia had told her, very professionally and concisely, that there was not. She had then sent Renata's contact information to my inbox in case I wanted it for any reason. I deleted it immediately. I deleted it and made myself a cup of coffee and went to the garden, and that was that. There was nothing to feel about Renata anymore. Not anger, not satisfaction, not curiosity. She had tried to take something that was not hers and it had not worked and she had lost her marriage over it, and whatever else had followed from that was her own life to sort out, entirely separate from mine. I wished her nothing. Not bad things and not good things. Just nothing, the way you feel about a stranger in a city you have no plans to visit. Nothing. The cleanest kind of nothing. I want to circle back to Marcus because this is not a simple story and he is not a simple part of it. He came in spring as he asked. The roses were blooming, the new dawn in full first flush, the fence covered entirely. He stood in front of them for a long moment before saying anything. Then he said, "Mom, I wish Dad could see these." I said, "I think he would have liked them." Marcus said, "I think he would have liked what you did. What this place became." I did not answer right away. We stood there with the roses and the spring light and the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood. Then I said, "Come help me plant the hellebore." He had sent it at Christmas, and it had been on the windowsill all winter, and it was time to give it proper ground. We planted it together in the corner of the bed where the light was right. He was careful with it. He knew what he was handling. When it was in, we both stood back and looked at it, small and unassuming in its new place, exactly where it would grow into something worth seeing. He said, "Will it bloom this year?" I said, "Probably not the first year. But it will. It's a hellebore. It comes back reliably, every year without fail, once it's properly rooted." He knew I was talking about more than the hellebore. He nodded. He did not say anything. We went inside and I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and he told me something I had not known, that on Christmas Eve 2 years ago, after I had left, he had gone to his room and sat alone for a long time before Renata had come to find him. He said in that time alone he had known, completely and clearly, that he had done something he could not undo. He had not stopped it anyway. He said he did not have a sufficient reason for that. Said, "I know." He said, "I know you know." We finished our coffee. He said he needed to go. He stood at the door and I stood at the door and we looked at each other in the way that two people look at each other when they have been through something together that changed the dimensions of everything. He said, "Same time next year." Said yes. He nodded. He left. I stood at the front door of my house, and watched him walk to his car. He turned once and waved. I waved back. Then I closed the door, went to the kitchen, washed both coffee cups, and stood at the window looking at my garden. I want to tell you about the morning of the ribbon cutting at the foundation, because it was the kind of morning that makes you feel the full span of your own life all at once. I woke early. I made my coffee. I went to the garden before getting ready. The roses were in their second season on the roofline now, fuller and more confident than the year before. The Margaret Hartwell garden markers had been installed the week prior, small handsome signs that said the garden's name and its purpose. I touched one of them in the morning light. My mother had been a quiet woman. She had not had what you would call a dramatic life. She had her garden and her church and her family and her kitchen, and she had treated all of those things with a consistent and serious care that I had absorbed without being able to name it until I was much older. She had planted roses on the back fence of a house she and my father rented for 30 years without owning. She had grown things she would never fully possess, on ground that was never legally hers, because the growing was what mattered to her and the ownership was beside the point. I thought about her as I stood in the garden that morning. I thought about what she had given me by example and what I had carried from her kitchen and her garden and her index card recipe and her steady and unpretentious way of moving through a life that was hers because she had built it from the inside out, not because anyone had handed it to her. I thought she would have been glad about the garden program. I thought she would have been glad about the children coming in June. I thought she might have cried a little at the name on the sign, and then gone back to work. The ribbon cutting was at noon. I arrived at my own house, the former my own house, the permanently and appropriately my own house, at 11:30. Carolyn met me at the front door. She had flowers which I had not expected. She handed them to me and said, "Welcome, Louise." I looked at my front door, the door I had been locked out of on Christmas Eve 2 years before. The door I had unlocked with my own key the afternoon the sheriff's deputy had sent them packing. The door I had walked through every morning and evening of my adult life in this house. "Welcome home," I said back to her. The ceremony was brief and warm. Board members and community figures and a journalist from the local paper and some of the families who would use the resource center. Carolyn spoke. I spoke briefly about my mother and about what gardens teach and about what it means to build something that will outlast you. People applauded. Someone had brought cake. There was good coffee. Children from the neighborhood looked curiously at the garden through the side gate. I made a note to ask Carolyn if we could let them in, just briefly, just to look. She said of course. We opened the gate. They came in the way children come into a garden, immediately and entirely, spreading out to the corners of it without being told, finding things, the roses on the fence, the iris bed, the raised vegetable bed, the little hellebore in the corner that was just beginning to show its first proper growth. A small girl, maybe 7, crouched down in front of it and looked at it very seriously. She asked me what it was. I told her it was a hellebore. I told her it would bloom in winter, which is the best thing about hellebores. They bloom when everything else has gone quiet. She considered that. Then she said, I think I like it. I said, I think I do too. She stood up and went off to look at the roses, and I stood next to the hellebore for a moment and thought about Marcus planting it on a spring morning with careful hands, and about my mother's roses on the back fence of a rented house, and about bare sticks in brown paper arriving in the mail in February during the worst of everything. I thought about how long the distance was between those bare sticks and this particular morning, this garden, these children, this name on the sign, this small girl crouching down to look at a winter-blooming plant and deciding she liked it. That evening I called Vera. I told her about the ribbon cutting and the children and the small girl and the hellebore. Vera said, Louise, you understand that you built something, don't you? Not just a garden. I said I was beginning to understand it. She said, good. Take your time. It is a lot to understand all at once. I said I had time. She said she was glad for that. We talked for another half hour about nothing in particular, which is one of the best ways to spend an evening. I went to bed that night feeling something that I can only call gratitude, not for what had happened, but for what I had done with it. I want to tell you one more thing about the first day of the garden program, because this is where I want you to leave this story. June. Early morning. The garden was at its fullest. The roses and the iris and the raised beds all producing at once. The hellebore settled into its corner. Not blooming, it was summer now, but green and rooted and looking exactly like something that would be there in winter when the rest had gone quiet. 12 children arrived at 9 in the morning. They had their wellies and their curious faces, and they had clearly been told something about this garden because they arrived already interested. I walked them through the whole garden first. I named things and explained things and answered the questions that came, which were good questions, the kind children ask when they are actually paying attention. Then I gave each of them a small section of the raised bed, and I gave each of them seeds, and I showed them how to read what the packet said about depth and spacing, and I showed them how to make a row and how to plant a seed and how to water it just enough and not too much. The small girl from the ribbon cutting was there. She worked very seriously and carefully. When they had all planted their rows, I asked them to step back and look at what they had done. 12 children looking at a garden bed. They had planted things that were not yet visible, that were currently nothing but seeds underground, that required time and water and the right season and a certain amount of faith to become what they were meant to be. I asked them how long they thought it would take. They guessed. Some of the guesses were very wide of the mark and some were surprisingly accurate. I told them the real answer. I told them we would check together every Wednesday. Then I told them something I had been thinking about all morning. I said, here is the most important thing about a garden. You can tend it as carefully as you want, and some things will still not come up the way you expected. Some seasons are harder than others. Sometimes things go wrong and you have to start over. But a garden that is tended keeps going. Does not stop because one season was hard. Does not quit because one thing did not work. You put your hands in the ground and you pay attention and you come back and you keep going. That is what a garden is. They listened in the way children listen when they know something is being said that matters. Then the small girl raised her hand. She said, what if someone messes up your garden? Someone who isn't supposed to. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about Christmas Eve. I thought about Renata in the doorway and the key that would not turn and the 3 minutes in the car and the call to Patricia and the new locks and the will and the foundation and the endowment and the ribbon cutting and this morning in this garden with these 12 children and the seeds now in the ground. I said, then you clear out what they did and you plant again. She thought about that. Then she nodded. with a completeness that children nod when something has settled for them. She bent back down to her section of the raised bed and smoothed the soil with her hand, the careful flat-palmed smoothing of someone who is taking it seriously. I stood in my mother's garden, which was now my garden, which was now the city's garden, and I felt the full weight and lightness of that simultaneously. All of it true at once. That afternoon, after the children had gone, I sat in the garden alone for a while. The summer light came through the roses on the fence and made patterns on the path. The city was quiet in that particular afternoon way. I had a cup of tea. I had my garden journal. I wrote down what the small girl had asked and what I had answered. I wrote she understood it immediately. I thought that was the best possible outcome. I thought a girl who understood that answer at 7 years old would be in better shape for whatever came next than I had been at that age. I thought about who I had been before all of this and who I was now. Not so different in the ways that went all the way through. The same person who had run a hospital department and raised a son alone and tended a garden and loved Gerald and learned from my mother. But clearer now. Less willing to leave things unsaid when saying them was what was required. Less willing to stay small to make other people comfortable. More aware of my own ground and what it was worth and who had the right to stand on it. These are not small things to learn. I am glad I learned them. The roses on the fence above me moved a little in the afternoon air. The pale pink flowers, the new dawn, the color of my mother's fence in my memory. They had reached the roofline. They were going further now, over the top, which I had not entirely planned for but which I found I did not mind at all. Things that are properly rooted and well tended will go further than you intended them to. That is not a problem. That is the whole point. I wrote that in the journal too. Then I closed it and finished my tea and sat in my own garden on a June afternoon in the second year of the rest of my life, and let it be exactly what it was. Patricia called that week to check in. She does that occasionally now, not about legal matters but just to check in, which I have decided is what happens when you have been through something substantial with someone over a period of time. She asked how the garden program had gone. I told her about the children and the seeds and the small girl's question and my answer. There was a pause. Then she said, "Louise, you should write all of this down." I said I already had, in a garden journal. She said, "That is a start." Thought about that. I am not sure this story is over. Stories that are still being lived rarely have clean endings. Or if they do, the ending has not arrived yet. Marcus will come in November to help cut the roses back again. Vera will come for Sunday dinners. Sylvia will call on Saturdays. The children will come on Wednesdays and the seeds they planted are already showing their first true leaves. Small and serious and entirely themselves, doing exactly what they were planted to do. The house will be full of families who need it. The endowment will do its work over years and decades. The hellebore will bloom in winter as hellebores do. The roses will come back in spring. The small girl who smoothed the soil with such care will come back on Wednesday to check her row, and I will be there, and the garden will be there, and we will look together at what is growing and what still needs time and what will come up eventually if you tend it and trust the season. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is the whole thing, in fact, the full and sufficient thing, which I did not always know but which I know now, standing in my garden in the morning with my coffee and my roses and this good and entirely mine life. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength or the strength of a woman you love, please subscribe to Granny's Voice. We tell stories here for women who have stayed quiet too long and for everyone who has ever had to choose between who they were and who someone else needed them to be. Hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, and leave a comment below telling us what part of Louise's story stayed with you. We are glad you are here. Don't lose us. Subscribe to Granny's Voice today.